And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. As you know, if you're a regular viewer or listener, we've been doing a series of conversations about the state of the media 2024. Sneak preview, if you haven't seen any of them, it's not that good. And joining me now is someone who's an expert in this area, the state of the media. I really rely on his work and appreciate his insights. He's been on the program before. Mickey Huff is the director of Project Censored, which does great work in highlighting the censored or suppressed, or as they now say, deprecated news stories that were important in the past year. And he is also the co-editor of a new issue of The Progressive magazine, and the co-author of an article in that issue called None of the Above Exposing Election Year News Abuse. So first of all, Mickey, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, RJ. It's great to be on with you. And again, really appreciate your work, your coverage, and your analysis, especially around media issues. So thank you so much for having us back on your program.
Oh, back at you, man. So, okay, so let's start with this phrase, news abuse. Where'd you come up with that? It's interesting.
Yeah, so Project Censored's been around since 1976, or basically the oldest media watchdog continuously running in the United States. Andy Lee Roth and I do the annual book, right? We have a book every year that looks at the underreported stories, censored stories. We sort of analyze what's going on in corporate media. We also talk about and highlight the importance of the independent press, and we show where there is really great public interest journalism happening. It's happening all around us. It's not happening on the corporate platforms, and it's sometimes hard for people to find. That's why we teach media literacy. But we also analyze news in different ways. And you're asking about a news abuse frame. The founder of Project Censored, Carl Jensen, came up with the phrase junk food news in 1983 to talk about how the news media increasingly covered garbage, tabloidized, sensationalist information as real news, right? Modern day example would be, whatever Taylor Swift is doing this week with football Ken or whatever, sport Ken, what have you. News abuse is a more serious frame, whereas some journalists and scholars said, well, things like the O.J. Simpson trial and some of those things, they might be sensationalized and tabloidized and overblown, but they're not unserious stories, right? They're about serious issues, but the media cartoonishly frames them in different ways for profit, right? And so news abuse was a phrase coined by Peter Phillips, the second director of Project Censored, to make that distinction that talks about how the news media, they don't just tabloidize, idiotic, trivial, sensationalized things, but they'll actually take a serious news story and they'll strip it of its parts. They'll eliminate context. In other words, news abuse is a specific kind of propaganda. It's news that looks newsworthy. It looks like an article or a story. It's about a topic most people would agree that is serious or important. But the way in which it's covered is, let's say, not terribly journalistic. It's partially covered, or it's spun, right? Or it's more of an op-ed, even though it's presented as hard news.
Right.
So news abuse is a really interesting category that allows us to openly talk about propaganda without necessarily having the baggage of that terminology. And RJ, even in the last decade, the term propaganda has been bandied about to such a degree that it's been conflated with the fake news weaponization. In other words, if I disagree with you, it's fake news. It's my truth, your propaganda. And, we've really spun ourselves into these media silos. Team red and team blue, right? Where we can't get outside of that. And the news abuse analysis is really part of that. It's part of that frame. The way in which the news media cover elections like horse races, right? Who's ahead by here and how much and how many are ahead in the swing states. And why does that matter 9 months before the election? In other words, the media don't really cover the issues that people are interested in the electorate. They cover the way in which candidates are jockeying for attention through media. And the issues are kind of sprinkled in on the side to ruffle feathers and wake up Team Red and Blue cheerleaders. But there's serious lack of journalistic integrity, lack of in-depth coverage of serious matters. And nobody wants to seem to do, I mean, other than if it's like the gotcha journalism of Trump paying off, Stormy Daniels. Where's the deep investigative reporting in the major newspapers about the real kind of election interference that we've seen over the last couple election cycles, not from countries like Russia, but from countries like Israel,
Right.
or from the significant influence of the AIPAC lobby? And here is now, RJ, our disclaimer for the program: criticism of the Israeli attacks on Gaza, criticism of the right wing of the Israeli government is not akin to anti-Semitism. There are serious anti-Semites in the world. There are serious strains of racism in the world that must be tackled and pushed back and eliminated. But to conflate criticism of what's happening right now in the Middle East with that is a rhetorical tactic to shut down discussion and debate. It's very sad, RJ, to see many Democrats now engaged in this kind of sophistry, this kind of news abuse. The liberal media is engaged in this kind of spurious labeling of people who are critics, rightful critics of the Biden administration support for what the International Criminal Court has called a plausible genocide. And we're seeing 37,000, some put 45,000. Ralph Nader was talking last week about there being even double the potential figures of death happening in Gaza. The real problem is the news media in the West don't care and don't want to know about that. That's an example of news abuse too, RJ, and that's what we kind of talk about, which really is just deconstructing propaganda.
I think you use a great example in the student protesters, for example, the encampments and the coverage of those. I visited one encampment. I've been in touch with a lot of the student leaders. And I just wrote a long piece about the so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act passed by the House now,
Yes.
which is Orwellian. I know that's an overused term, but it literally, I went into it in depth and found that, and it's on zerohourreport.com if anyone wants to read, but and found that that law, which supposedly is designed to fight anti-Semitism, which is already covered by existing civil rights law, that law could actually allow a non-Jew to take action against a Jew for discussing Jewish cultural history, because Jewish cultural history is filled with a lot, or Jewish theology, because there's a branch of Jewish theology that says the creation of Israel is illegitimate, theologically illegitimate. I don't have an opinion on that, but I'm not a theologian or anything, but the fact that it would bar that kind of speech and that that's not being discussed in the mainstream media, and again, and in terms of news abuse, and then I'd want your thoughts, but it seems to me the perfect example of that is the fact that the coverage of these loving and peaceful protesters, which is what I saw at the encampment, what focused on one or two people who said anti-Semitic things, or for example, at Columbia, people who were not Columbia students who weren't even admitted to the campus. So the irony, so that to me is a perfect example of news abuse, right? And to top it off, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, so-called, rightly says it's anti-Semitic to blame all Jews for the actions of one or a few Jews. But that's exactly what they're doing. First of all, the people of Gaza, blaming them for October 7th. And secondly, the student protesters, blaming them for the actions of one or two people. So it seems to me that this ongoing horror in Gaza and the fact that even if a majority wants a ceasefire, that 100%, 99% of people don't want a ceasefire, is lethal news abuse. Is that right?
Yeah, RJ, we should ask you to write the chapter for next year's book. You seem to have a really good understanding of the concept of news abuse, but also the consequences of news abuse, right? This isn't just an academic exercise where we're picking apart journalists are picking apart the establishment press for gotcha points or so students understand something on an exam. The consequences in the real world are the lives and deaths of people that are the recipients of U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-backed foreign policy, the actions of other state leaders, the actions of hedge funds, the purveyors of dark money, right? All the people behind the scenes and so on that are orchestrating many things that are happening around the world, they have real consequences. They have real victims, right? And the corporate media loves to play with the worthy and unworthy victims frame, right? Going back to Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent. And again, I will say this out loud. We shouldn't have to, but what happened on October 7 is an absolute travesty of justice. It's a horrendous attack on society, on people. The lives of people lost there are just as tragic as the lives of people that are lost in Gaza and elsewhere. It's not a game like that, right? And that's what the media likes to play. So when we just saw this, quote, heroic rescue effort, right? You know, what's attached to that is perfidy. We see the U.S. aid pier being used to have surreptitious rescue missions or things shipped through. This is, again, international war crime stuff. They rescue 4 people, 4 hostages, kill at least 210 completely innocent Gazans in the process, Palestinians, sorry, in the process. And most all of the Western press is just talking about the stories of the 4 people that were rescued and how harrowing it is and so on. And you know what, RJ? They should. That is important to cover. But is it not also important to cover how it happened, the 210, 250 lives of other innocent people lost in the process, the completely deceitful means by which it was it played out? In other words, this is back to news abuse, right?
Right.
We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We should have media that can cover all the many different angles of this in a way that illustrates its complexity or illustrates its humanity and or lack thereof on any side. I'm sure there's probably going to be some people out there thinking I'm both sidesing this. I'm not. It's obvious that this has been an extraordinary example of disproportionate attack against the civilian population by Israel on Palestinians. But the news media should be covering all the things that are happening. We shouldn't be having the New York Times telling their reporters what words they're not allowed to use about Palestinians in Gaza. We shouldn't have the Western media outlets running news through the Jerusalem Bureau and through IDF censors. And we shouldn't be allowing the major ally in the Middle East, Israel, to be banning Al Jazeera and shutting down journalists, not to mention the fact that they've been responsible for killing the most number of journalists in a short period of time in modern recorded history. So it's not a balanced issue in this regard, right? So I'm not both sidesing it in that way. But news abuse really allows us to crack this open and look at the many different things that news media do, what they do right or wrong, but how it's less important, I think, about the right, the wrong, and it's more significant to look through the prism of the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, right? Where journalism's job is to tell people what's really going on, to be transparent, to not cause harm. That's a major tenet of journalistic ethics. You know, take a look at the Western press coverage of what's happening in that region. It's certainly it's causing harm.
Right.
It's facilitating harm.
Along with that ethos should come an acceptance of the fact that however nice a person you are in your personal life, people are sometimes going to be really mad at you, right? And that's the journalist's role. And it's really interesting, Mickey, because as you use the term both sidesism, right? Because that's the thing people say all the time, oh, you're both sidesing it. What I was going to pivot to in our conversation was the kind of black and white or binary thinking that drives a lot of news narrative. So that, for example, I mean, another story that I cover a lot is Ukraine and what's really going on there, Russia, Ukraine. And another, where it's absolutely impossible, for example, to write a piece, as I did, pointing out that Ukrainian generals, American generals, independent tactical experts think the Ukrainians cannot beat the Russians. They can't. So they have to work out some sort of settlement. that triggers such rage because I think the media have done this good guy, bad guy thing where it's like, and no, I'm not siding with Russia. Russia is committing war crimes. I
Yes.
despise Putin. I despise oligarchs of all nationalities. Uh, but
Here, here.
but the fact is, out of compassion and love for the Ukrainian people, nostalgia for the fact that they kicked my grandparents out 100 years ago, I guess, is that. But I'm entitled to Ukrainian citizenship, interestingly enough. But I don't want them to die because of global geopolitics and the West's and the US's desire to militarily drain Russia to make an Afghanistan out of Ukraine for
Ukraine.
Cold War purposes. But this binary thinking, it seems to me, and so the phrase both sidesism, you've already bought into it if you use the word both sidesism. Oh, Eskow, you're both, oh, Huff, you're both sidesing it. Well, what makes you think it's a two-sided thing? Do you get what I'm
Yeah.
driving at?
I get what you're driving at, and I'm a big fan of I'm a big fan of talking about, that's the false dilemma fallacy, either or. What about the third, fourth, fifth, sixth sides? What about all the nuances and gray areas in between all of these spaces? But see, that's not sexy, RJ. That doesn't sell.
Right,
When you go to somebody with a hard line, and you talked about black and white binaries. When it comes to corporate media and American politics, we can talk about the red and the blue. Right? We can talk about the red and the blue filters and
right,
team red, team
absolutely.
blue,
Yeah,
right? And it goes through this filter. And it's this, and social media has amplified many of those silos now that half of Americans get news from these kinds of things. And we write about those things too in the latest issue of the Progressive magazine. Nolan Higdon does. Big hat off to Norm Stockwell, by the way, and the people of the Progressive for covering media literacy in the election year, because it's such an important issue. As you can see, RJ, media literacy is kind of wafting around over every topic we bring up, right?
right,
What people think about or know about things happening in Russia, Ukraine is influenced by a variety of things: their peer groups,
right,
their upbringing, their history, their backgrounds, their consumption of information and news. Where do they get it? Where don't they get it? Right. And so that, whatever your main area of interest is, as Nick Johnson, the FCC chairperson from decades ago once wrote, he said, whatever your primary area of interest, if your second area isn't media democracy or media reform or supporting the free press in some way, you're likely to gain very little ground in any of your other areas of interest, because how we are informed it really matters. It matters that we have groups talking about a same topic, but they seem to have their own set of facts, right?
right,
And as Mark Twain once quipped, get your facts first, then you can distort them as much as you please.
right,
Um,
exactly. Yeah, and
right?
what you just said, when I was working for Bernie Sanders in 2016, I used to say you can't have a political revolution without a media revolution because people won't know what the hell is going on. And the fact that this is an election year is important. For example, in the 2020 campaign, which I was, just a journalist for, I didn't participate. Uh, in that campaign, you had a lot of talk about would Biden come back? Is Pete Buttigieg the new flavor of the month? Is this, that? But no discussion, for example, of the fact that two of the candidates were running on a program of Medicare for all, the others were not, and that a Harvard study, Steffi Woolhandler and these people said that 68,000 people die a year because we don't have something like Medicare for all. Well, one death is a lot sexier than 68,000, I guess. And so they'll report a death, a dramatic death, a murder, what have you. But those unsexy deaths are human losses too.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that's also an example of how it works in an election year. And that everything gets boiled down to either if I criticize Biden, oh, you want Trump?
Yeah. 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 That's
And
my
in other
favorite.
circles, if I criticize Trump, uh,
You're a
who,
Biden supporter?
oh yeah, what you think Biden's great? Well, no, I actually think truth is great.
Yeah.
I, I'm into truth. That's the
Yeah.
job. And I don't know about you, Mickey, but if I write something And it turns out that the ship that I cited that and said sank in 1948 sank in 1947. I'm like clinically depressed for 3 days. It doesn't
Yeah, yeah,
matter.
yeah,
I
yeah.
cannot stand not
Yeah.
being correct. And it blows my mind in terms of the media, how many major media figures, they get something spectacularly wrong. Okay,
Yeah.
whatever. They
Moving
still,
along, yeah, and they love
yeah,
to shift the goal. They love to move the goalposts. They love to shift the baselines. They love to gaslight serially. They like to rewrite history. The word Orwellian is apt. If it's
right,
overused, it's only because we live in much more of an Orwellian universe than even he predicted.
right,
When you sprinkle on Aldous Huxley, you get what Neil Postman wrote, Amusing Ourselves to Death in 1985,
right,
which I think was way, it was a really kind of on the way. If Neil Postman were alive today, I mean, I don't know what he would be doing other than saying, "Well, I told you so."
right,
Uh,
right,
I don't know. I mean, it's like it's so, and we wrote about this in other books, like United States of Distraction, about media manipulation in post-truth America. And the main parts of the thesis were like, well, this isn't new. This isn't a new thing. We've had propaganda and mis and disinformation and bogus stories, but now we have such consolidation of media and control of digital media, and we have such saturation of it, right? And it's been so atomized and individualized in some ways, even though on the top it's all still collectivized, maintaining the illusion
right,
of great diversity. That's a very sophisticated system of propaganda.
right.
And so the idea that we can weaponize that and politicize it, where the Republicans like to do it, in their ways by castigating the liberal media. They've been doing that since the Nixon years. But the Democrats love to do it too. They just like to do it, by labeling people conspiracy theorists,
Right,
or they like to do it by pointing to Russia,
right.
Russiagate. I wonder if Joe McCarthy ever died. We just with the encampments, you were
He
bringing up the
didn't
student
die. He was
protest.
digitized.
Yeah,
Uh,
totally. And
the,
Nancy Pelosi is like, we need to do some investigation on these students. They're being paid from the Kremlin. I'm just like,
right,
it's so dumb to even say it out loud that if there's even half a chance that you honestly believe that, you probably need to be clinically examined. I mean,
right, right.
people have
No,
made total cottage industries out of this. Rachel Maddow's, and I know some people
a
on the
hundred
right.
percent.
They have not let this go. It's Russia all day long, despite the fact that numerous studies, not just ones we've done at Project Censored, but Harvard scholars, like Yochai Benkler wrote Network Propaganda, Manipulation, Disinformation, and Radicalization in American Politics. Jeff Girth did an exhaustive report for the Columbia Journalism
It
Review.
was terrific,
I mean,
terrific.
again,
Yeah,
these are not fringe
right.
institutions. These are mainstream institutions, mainstream, which isn't always a great label, right?
No,
Um, but
no,
it's preposterous that they keep going back to the toolbox because it works on a certain part of the population, right? And look, does Russia try to manipulate and influence elections? Of course.
right,
Does China? Yes. So is the United States 80 times in the last 70 some years. The Clinton administration was largely responsible for the election of Boris Yeltsin in the mid
right.
90s. I mean, they
I
really
know
kicked the
very well.
scales there.
I was
You
a
know what I mean?
contractor
So
for the State Department. I know very
let's just,
well.
yeah. So let's just notice how they just turn that into some one-sided issue where suddenly we're all now the victims of false information from Russia. I'm more worried about the false information coming from the New York Times
Right,
than Russian trolls in some Macedonian teenager's basement or something.
right.
And again, that's not to make light of it, but the
Russia
media
spent
blows up what's not real and important. Go ahead.
Russia spent, I think, $120,000 on Facebook or something. It
Yeah, yeah,
was
yeah, yeah. It amounts to nothing.
my favorite was the meme of Jesus and the devil arm wrestling to see if Clinton or Trump would win, especially since Jesus looked more like Cat Stevens. But um, that gets me to another topic because whenever we try to talk about media literacy,
Yes.
we all of a sudden could find ourselves in the parking space right next to what I consider to be one of the largest mind control operations out there, which is the idea that social media literacy means massive digitized censorship of unpopular positions. Media literacy means if a physician disagrees with the consensus on topic A, it's
Yeah.
not enough to say, well, the CDC will issue a statement disagreeing with that. He will be, unbeknownst to himself, rendered invisible to the world on social media. For example, the
Yeah.
so-called
Shadow
deprecation.
banning.
Yeah,
Yeah. Algorithmic censorship, shadow
yeah,
banning. It's
yeah,
huge. We've been writing about this at the project for a long time because it's the new face of censorship,
right.
digitized from Silicon Valley, from these major tech companies that all go back to DARPA money in the military industrial complex, going back to the 50s and the Cold War. This is among the best surveillance data harvesting machines ever invented. Things like Facebook, or as
Right.
media scholars like Siva Vaidnathan call social media, anti-social media.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are so many other really negative things about the health impacts and screen time and so on. Look, that's not to say social media can't be used for good and can't be used to communicate good things. Like platforms can do good or bad, but the way in which it's set up and how it's generally used, and the fact that most people only learn, quote, how to use the platform, not how they're being used by the platform. That's the critical media literacy element. Unbeknownst to millions, people are just wafting their information around, sharing all the details of their lives, and fueling this generative AI revolution, which is nothing more than a mass plagiarism and a mass theft of identity.
I have a
Um,
piece coming out in Current Affairs about that. How it's a,
yeah, well,
how it's something like collective intellectual property. Nobody should have the right to own it or control it or manipulate us with it. But
yeah.
so yeah, I mean we're on the same page, and I guess uh, so we have to be able to distinguish in the public mind between true media literacy, which
Well,
is
yeah,
knowing when you're being lied to and manipulated,
well, we don't
and
need a barrage of fact checkers. We don't need a bunch of biased fact checkers coming out of the military industrial complex or the national intelligence complex, the national security complex. They go to work at Facebook, they go to work for Meta, they go to work for Alphabet, Google, YouTube, and they're the ones behind the algorithms. They're the ones curating who you get to see and not see. They're the ones that are doing
right.
shadow banning in the guise of fact checking and under the guise of fighting fake news. This is merely a Trojan horse for mass censorship. We've been writing about this for years. So too has Alan McLeod at Mint Press News. So have various others. And this goes even further, RJ, not just to the curation element, right? But it goes and it permeates even our entertainment
Yeah.
sphere, our entire entertainment universe. Roger Stahl, did a great film on this called Theaters of War, how the Pentagon and CIA took Hollywood. Thousands of movies and TV shows and streaming programs that we watch all the time, so many of them have some hand from the CIA, from the military, from the Pentagon. This is the kind of thing we're talking about, that if you want to have that blockbuster movie with all the gadgets from the military, they've got to see the script. This is known. This is public information, right? The degree to which our information is curated, is managed, is censored is actually extraordinary in an
Right.
era of alleged, super information access, right? We live in extraordinarily ironic times, RJ, right?
Sadly
This is
true. Yeah. Go
media
ahead.
literacy is important because it helps us understand how these are both true, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's so important, and I want to maybe circle back and close on another point you made, which
Mhm.
is that as pernicious, first of all, I call it Ma Bell with mind control. I think everybody thought that Ma Bell was too much of a monopoly, so they broke it up. These social media companies are monopoly. But if I want to send a message to my friends that says, hey, I'm going to this demonstration for cause XYZ, it may never get there and I'll never know. There's this insidious manipulative element of it that's far vaster than we realize. But I do maybe want to close on the fact that what's gotten lost in all of this, and really, I got to hand it to the powers that be. I mean, hats off to them in a dark kind of way, that, during the Iraq War, a lot of Democrats, anyway, were really aware of the manipulation of misuse of information, mistrusted the intelligence agencies, which in my life, which is a long life, goes back to the 60s, right?
Yes.
Rightfully so. But what they managed to do after the election of Trump was now the heroes are James Clapper, who lied to Congress as an intelligence official, John Brennan, James Comey, who lied to all of us and said there were 5,000 terrorist
Mueller.
sleeper cells.
Yeah, the FBI comes in as the
Mueller,
hero. It's
yeah,
like Dragnet Redux.
right. Yeah. There are 1,000 stories in the Naked City. This is one of them. And so to me, it means that we cannot trust New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. I'll just close with this. I was seated next to a very, very famous left-wing celebrity at a small dinner, and that person turned to me. I was working for Bernie, or they said he worked for Bernie in the last election, and she said, "I think he's controlled by Russia." And I said, I think you've been watching too much MSNBC.
Uh-huh.
And so it was an awkward moment, but I don't want to leave, you know, that side of it out. So, yes, democracy does die in darkness, but the shadows, they're all around us. That's my final word. I guess what's yours?
Yeah, well, the democracy dies in darkness, especially when billionaires like Jeff Bezos can turn off the lights.
Right, exactly.
I
Yeah,
mean, we write about ownership, the billionaire press. I mean, Upton Sinclair wrote about this in 1919 about, the brass check and the
right,
owners of the press and how reporters, were basically, just prostitutes for that's literally what Upton Sinclair was saying, right? In the terminology of his time and what he was referring to. But even 10 years before that, and it's pointed out in this month's Double Progressive magazine that I urge people to check out because it's all about media literacy. There's a great history in it. There's a great piece in it, and I wanted to end with this because one of the many hats I wear is as an historian. And to me, going back and understanding that there has been corruption in journalism, there have been movements to reinforce and strengthen public interest journalism through muckraking reporting. These struggles aren't new. We can learn from the past and adapt to the challenges we face now in the present. But one great one was, and it's in this issue, is from a public education activist, William Kittle, that wrote about the making of public opinion.
yeah,
All the way back in 1909,
right,
before Eddie Bernays joined the Creel
right,
Commission, before the selling of World War I, before he wrote the book Propaganda in 1928, before the Banana Republic in the 1950s, right? So we've had people calling attention to the conflicts of interest that own the media and their cozy connections with business and the political sphere. The great Lincoln Steffens wrote about the unholy alliance, right, and the shame of the cities between elected officials and private business people. Like this has been going on for ages and ages, and the exposure of that corruption led to many reformative political movements, imperfect, but
right,
movements that made a real difference on social justice causes. And they also worked to douse growing cynicism in difficult times. And I think that that's a good note to end on for me, is that I think we should be skeptical of all of our media sources, no matter where they come from.
good,
Trust but verify. Don't get to quote Ronald Reagan too often, do we?
right, right.
But cynicism goes a step further into negativity, that things can never be better and they can never change. And I think that's a really dangerous flirtation, RJ. And that's why I think critical media literacy education is our hope. It's about teaching people how to think more clearly and critically, not telling them what to think. It's about telling them to understand all the teams on the playing field and the teams that aren't on the field, and understanding who writes the rules and why. It's about knowing that Team Red and Team Blue are basically part of a theatrical expose of what those that own the establishment would like us to see and how they like us to play, and that we, the people, need to remember that this is our game and we should be controlling the rules. We should be determining the candidates, and we should be having our votes count to have people in public office represent the things that we truly want. And the majority of Americans don't want either of these candidates at the top of the party. They should be out. A majority of Americans don't want to support the ongoing slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. That should stop yesterday. A majority of Americans want health care. Give it to us. We could go on and on,
Of
RJ,
course, yeah.
about the great disconnect between what the people say and what the politicians do. The media is in the middle and they're the wedge. We, the people, have to reclaim a public media and independent media in our interest, inform each other to be meaningfully civically engaged, and wrest this system from the cynical people who are now destroying it.
Extremely well said. And Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored, I feel like we could go on a
We
long
could.
time with this. We should do this more often. So you can find Project Censored at, I believe, projectcensored.org, right?
That is right, RJ. Yep.
And look,
ProjectCensored.org is you can find out all about us for free. Lots of our information, our curriculum, our critical media literacy education information. We do media literacy books for young people. We've got free curriculum and
fantastic.
resources. If you're out there and want to learn more about media literacy and how to bring it to your communities and your schools, 5 states now mandate it. We need more media literacy education. Feel free to get a hold of us at projectcensored.org.
And read the latest issue of The Progressive magazine. Mickey, thanks for coming on the program, and thanks for all your great work.
Thanks, RJ. My pleasure.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.